Operation Solstice, also known as Unternehmen Husarenritt, the Stargard tank battle, was one of the last German armored offensive operations on the Eastern Front in World War II. It was originally planned as a major offensive but was executed as a limited attack. Though it was repulsed by the Red Army, it led to a decision by the Soviet High Command to postpone the planned attack on Berlin for 2 months. Planning. The operation took place in response to the Soviet advance on Berlin early in 1945. Starting January 12, 1945, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive had ripped open a gap hundreds of kilometers long in German defensive lines, and the Soviets had subsequently pushed from the Vistula River to the Oder River. As the Soviet advance to the west reached its farthest point, its apex narrowed, leaving long northern and southern flanks into which retreating German formations had moved and along which the Germans were attempting to re-establish a cohesive defensive line. General Heinz Guderian had originally planned to execute a major offensive against the First Belarusian Front, cutting off the leading elements of Georgy Zhukov's forces east of the Oder. The Soviet forces were to be attacked from Stargard in the north as well as from Glogau and Guben in the south. In order to carry out these plans, he requested that the Courland pocket be evacuated to make available the divisions trapped there, remove troops from Italy and Norway, and involved Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, which had been intended for counter-attacks in Hungary. In a meeting with Guderian, Hitler insisted that Courland be held and that the army continue with its planned attacks in Hungary. The meeting rapidly degenerated into a heated and farcical argument. After agreeing on a more limited counter-offensive, Hitler and Guderian then proceeded to have an even more heated argument when Guderian insisted that Walther Wenck direct the offensive rather than Heinrich Himmler. Hitler, despite almost screaming, according to Guderian's account, gave in on this point. Operational goals. In its final form, Operation Solstice consisted of a more limited counter-attack than had been originally planned by the 3 Corps of the 11th SS Panzer Army, which was being assembled in Pomerania against the spearheads of the First Belarusian Front. The German forces would first attack along a 50-kilometer front around Stargard southeastwards towards Arnswalde, where a small garrison had been encircled, with their ultimate objective being the relief of Kustrin. The Wehrmacht originally codenamed the Operation Husarenritt, but the SS insisted on the name Sonnenwende. Soviet intelligence Zhukov had been made aware of a build-up of German forces opposing his 61st and 2nd Guards tank armies, but did not have information as to the exact timing and nature of the attack. The Stauker of the Supreme Main Command had noted with concern that while the Germans had moved 13 divisions between the main Soviet forces and Berlin, 33 divisions had concentrated in Pomerania, lending credence to the possibility of a German strike from Pomerania into the exposed northern flank of the First Belarusian Front. Deployments. Wehrmacht. Over 1,200 tanks were allocated to the offensive, but no trains were available to transport them. In addition, due to serious shortages, only 3 days' ammunition and fuel were immediately available. German forces had also suffered heavy losses during the January combat in East Prussia and Poland. German sources admitted to 198,000 dead and missing for the first 2 months of 1945 in the region between the Baltic Sea and the Carpathian Mountains. Soviet sources claimed that operations by the First Ukrainian and Belarusian fronts during the Vistula-Oder offensive alone resulted in the deaths of 150,000 German troops, while the Germans were able to make good some of the losses through measures such as the mass mobilization of Volkssturm. The German German forces in the east had clearly suffered both significant quantitative and qualitative losses as a result of the two Soviet major offensives in January 1945. Red Army. While the First and Second Belarusian fronts were impressively large formations, the Soviet forces had also suffered serious losses in the Vistula-Oder offensive. At the beginning of February 1945, the strength of rifle divisions in the 1st BRF averaged around 4,000 troops and those of the 2nd BRF between 3,000 and 4,000. Soviet army strength was further weakened by the need to besiege encircled groups of German soldiers in Elbing, Poznan, Deutschkrone, and Schneidermühl. Armored strength was also weakened by the recent offensive operations. The 2nd BRF fielded only 297 well-worn tanks early in February 1945. During the period January 12–February 3, 1945, the 1st BRF suffered 77,342 casualties, while during the East Prussian offensive of January 13–February 10, 1945, the 2nd BRF took 159,490 casualties. In the same periods, the 1st Belarusian and Ukrainian fronts lost 1,267 armored fighting vehicles, while the 2nd and 3rd Belarusian fronts lost a staggering 3,525. Gun and mortar losses for the two groups of fronts were 374 and 1,644, respectively. To compound the difficulties, the Soviets faced supply difficulties as well as increased German air activity, resulting in increased unit requests for anti-aircraft weapons. The offensive, not all of the German units, which had to be reinforced across the bridges at Stettin, were ready on the planned start date of February 15. Nevertheless, a part of the Central Corps, the SS Division Nordland, attacked towards Arnswalde that day. Initially the offensive was successful. The opposing forces of 61st Army were taken by surprise and the German spearhead reached the besieged outpost of Arnswalde and relieved its garrison. A general attack opened the following day. The central corridor to Arnswalde was widened by the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, pushing part of the Soviet front 8 to 12 kilometers back. However, the attack by the 39th Panzer Corps was unable to reach the Plön Leg due to resistance by the Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Army, stalling some 70 kilometers from Kustrin after pushing the Soviets out of Salanthin and Musheren, reoccupying some land on the eastern shore of Lake Madu, and recapturing Piritz. Gruppe Munzel pushed them 4 kilometers to Liebenau, while the 3rd SS Panzer Corps advanced about kilometer to Rietz. Numbers of Soviet tanks and anti-tank guns were destroyed by German Tiger II heavy tanks, but the German heavy tanks also took losses. In general, German progress was hindered because of strong Soviet resistance and a thaw that created muddy conditions in which the heavy German tanks performed poorly. Soviet T-34s, on the other hand, with up to 25% lower ground pressure, had excellent mobility even in those conditions. On February 17, General Wenck, commander of the offensive, was seriously injured in a car accident. While being driven back from a briefing in Berlin, he took over driving from his driver and then himself fell asleep at the wheel. He was replaced by Hans Krebs, but command initiative had already been lost. Later that day, Dukov threw the 3rd Shock Army, which had redeployed from the area of Jastrow, into a counter-attack and the German offensive stalled. Army Group Vistula halted Sonnenwend on February 18. On February 19, Zhukov initiated a counter-offensive aimed at the capture of Stettin using the 61st and the 2nd Guards tank armies as well as the 7th Guards Cavalry Corps. However, it stalled in the heavy street fighting during the recapture of Arnswalde. There was no immediate German withdrawal, but the German command decided on February 21 to withdraw the headquarters of the 39th Panzer Corps as well as the Grenadier, Begli, Holstein, and 10th SS Panzer Divisions westward behind Army Group Center, practically ensuring that eastern Pomerania would fall to the Soviets. Zhukov's commitment of the 70th Army into an attack on February 23 spurred a retreat, with the German forces losing or abandoning many tanks. On February 24, Marshal Rokossovsky's Second Belarusian Front renewed the offensive into Pomerania, opening a 60-kilometer-wide gap in German lines west of Groznyadze and moving almost 50 kilometers forward, further reducing the cohesion of German defenses. Outcome: despite the initial gains, the operation was a complete failure. However, the operation convinced the Soviets to postpone their attack on Berlin while Pomerania was cleared in the East Pomeranian offensive.